Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The J Reels Podcast.
What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits. The page gets turned to not only November, but the fall and winter sports will get their full attention as I break down all that's taking place, as this is the J Reels Podcast with your host, J Reels. For my first timers, welcome aboard. And for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even as early as this past Thursday, I welcome you guys and gals back. And yes, now that baseball is in our rearview mirror, although there have been some things percolating over the last few days, which I'll get to later on, but now it's going to be full bore between now and I would say sometime in the middle of February, where it's going to be a lot of football. Yes, we'll sprinkle in some NBA. Yes, we'll sprinkle in some hockey and whatever else that may be over the next few months, but it's going to be NFL, college football to be the bulk of these podcasts moving forward. And I'll start off with the NFL. And I got to say this, the halfway point of the season is approaching. I know a lot of teams have already surpassed the 8-game or now 9-game mark, which is a little bit past the halfway point. And because of the stupid 17-game season, there is not a definitive halfway point. But you have a lot of teams that have already played 8 games, which technically isn't the halfway point. You got to get to that 9-game threshold in order to really start to talk about the second half, quote unquote, of the NFL season. But as of right this very moment, and I understand this fluctuates from week to week, we talked about a couple weeks ago how the Ravens were just an offensive juggernaut running roughshod through a lot of the teams in the AFC, and then, of course, losing to Cleveland last week, although they rebounded nicely against Denver. No shock there. Denver's a paper tiger, if you ask me. But we'd have to say that even though with an undefeated Kansas City Chiefs team who plays tonight against Tampa at home at 7-0, and for the rest of the league, we can look at who could be the top team. Does it really matter at this juncture of the season? No, but this is why we talk about these things here, as we are one more time at that halfway point of the season, that we'd have to say that the Detroit Lions right now are looking as formidable, as tough, and they're going to be set for a long postseason journey and probably will end up as the NFC representative in the Super Bowl come middle of February. The Lions, they've played well here, as we've seen. Yes, they did lose to the Buccaneers there back in week 2 at home, but since then they've been on a roll, and as indicative of the game yesterday at Lambeau, where a lot of people thought maybe the Packers could pull off a mild upset, considering that the Packers owed the Lions over the last 2 years, where the Lions have won in Green Bay, and that has been a house of horrors for the Lions dating back the last 3 decades plus. But for yesterday to go in there in the wet, rainy, windy Lambeau Field, and for a team that plays all their games indoors, and I believe it played their first 8 games indoors for the first time in quite some time, to where a team finally had the elements, finally played with a sky above, and possibly, in this case, obviously with some wind and rain, but that didn't sweat the Lions one bit as they went out and beat the Packers pretty handily, 24-14. They had a gift from Jordan Love, that pick 6, that I don't know what he was doing there, and I get it, he didn't want to get sacked, try to make a play, but that got returned to the house by Kirby Joseph. And Jared Goff, who is a low-key, when you think about it, MVP candidate. The guy week in and week out has been efficient, maybe not sexy with the numbers as far as 300-yard passing games and 4 touchdowns, but he was 18 for 22, high percentage passing as he's had throughout the course of the season. And the Lions continue to just move it along from one week to the next. We understand that their offense, that line is going to be stout and probably the best in the sport. You have guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, as well as David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs in the backfield, and Sam Laporta, who's had a down year for him. We know that last year he had a big year in the line offense, and for him to be able to even take not a step back, but almost not to play to his first year potential that he's had. And here it is, the Lions are 7-1 and have beaten the Vikings in Minnesota, beat Green Bay in Green Bay, and right now look like to be a team not only is going to be a powerhouse in the NFC North, but certainly throughout the conference, because when you look throughout the NFC, who else is going to be a threat? Yes, at the end of the day, we could look at San Francisco, and I'm going to turn my attention to the NFC West in a minute, because that has become just a jumbled mess and actually a pretty good division overall. But where else are you going to get a team that is going to make some hay and try to give the Lions a run for their money? Yes, we could talk about the Washington Commanders, who won again yesterday against the Giants. And for all that they've done this year with their rookie quarterback, Jaden Daniels, are the Commanders going to be a team in their first year with Dan Quinn as a head coach? Are they going to be on a march to a Super Bowl? Kind of premature to say that right now, despite the fact that they've been playing well over their heads. And I mean that in a good way. But we could look at the Commanders as a threat, but I can't see that right now, considering what the Lions have done last year and obviously this year. And this is without Aiden Hutchinson, their all-pro defensive lineman, as we all know, out with a broken leg, although there is some reports that he could possibly come back if the Lions do make it to a Super Bowl. That I'll have to believe it when I see it. But for other teams, I'm not going to look at the NFC South for a team like the Atlanta Falcons, who have played well at 6-3, but are they going to be a threat to the Lions in the NFC? And then you have the NFC West, which right now, if I would have told you today who is in first place in that division, the first team you probably think of would be the Niners, of course. And that is not the case. Niners had a bye yesterday, so they're going to regroup and get themselves primed for, I would think, a big second half to see if they can overtake the division. But at this very moment, no, it's not the Rams, who won in Seattle yesterday in overtime, and they did get a couple of big breaks along the way. They got a big pick six going the other way when the Seahawks were knocking on the door of punching it in for a touchdown, and then it got taken back to the house. And this was at 20-13, where they could have stamped the game right there and would have gone ahead and beaten the Rams, but they got a pick six going the other way, 104 yards, and then in overtime, where Matthew Stafford connected with DeMarcus Robinson with a one-handed grab, and we've seen a lot of one-handed grabs here over the last few days, from Garrett Wilson to what we saw there yesterday in overtime with DeMarcus Robinson and the like, Devontae Smith in the end zone against the Jacksonville Jaguars. All these one-handed and spectacular plays, but for DeMarcus Robinson to get that touchdown, to have the Rams, who looked like they were going to be dead and buried, but now they're at 500, with the Niners at 500, and the Seahawks now one game under 500. But guess what? The Arizona Cardinals, who beat the Chicago Bears, all right, no big whoop there, although the Bears came in with a winning record. But the Arizona Cardinals, not only are they in first place in the NFC West, but they're 2-0 in the division. They've already beaten the Niners in San Francisco. And remember, in week 2, they beat the Rams. So they have not played Seattle as of yet. And when you think about the Cardinals, a lot of people thought that this was going to be a team that was going to be coming up the rear with Kyler Murray coming back, trying to see if he could be in full form from where he was a few years ago when they actually made it into the postseason, although they meekly went out against the Rams. That was the year that the Rams went to the Super Bowl. And then bringing in Marvin Harrison Jr., a weapon for Kyler Murray, on top of James Conner, who is certainly not spectacular in the least coming out of the backfield, but is very steady and is a rock and pounds that rock to the tune of 107 yards there yesterday against the Bears. And I know you could question Matt Eberflus, where maybe it could be coaching malpractice, where he had the quarterback Caleb Williams in the game when they were already down 29-9 and tweaked his ankle. So who knows what his status is going to be moving forward. But the NFC West, I don't know if any of those teams are going to be able to match wits and talent. Maybe the Niners when it's all said and done. And it's going to be an interesting contest, I believe, in Week 17 when Detroit goes back to the scene of the crime when they lost in the NFC Championship game last year in San Francisco, or really Santa Clara. But what team out there in that conference is really going to go mano a mano with the Lions come January, and maybe not into February because that's when the Super Bowl is, but throughout that month? Right now, the Lions are looking like they're going to be the 1 seed. Granted, there's still plenty of games to be played, and a lot could surely happen. But I can't see Washington being a 1 seed when it's all said and done. I'm certainly not going to look at the Falcons, who right now, although have an extra game where the Lions have a game in hand, I can't see them being a 1 seed when the season comes to a conclusion. And then, of course, the NFC West, where the team that's in first place right now is just 1 game over 500. So I can't take any of those teams seriously as of right now. That's why the Lions are going to be a huge focal point in that conference throughout the rest of the season, and I think are going to come out at the end of the day as the champions in the NFC. And I actually picked them. I believe I did pick them to go to Super Bowl. Didn't I pick Buffalo Detroit as my Super Bowl this year? I believe so. And right, for what that's worth, who knows? We'll still have to watch it all unfold here over the course of the next couple of months. But the Lions, they're looking stout. They're looking like a team that's on a mission. And granted, I know I said this about the Ravens a couple of weeks ago, but the Ravens, they certainly have their flaws. And not every team, of course, we know that every team, we could certainly nitpick and say that it's not a strength here or there's a weakness on this team. But the Lions, even without their all-pro pass rusher, they're still a team I think is the one to beat there in the NFC. Besides that, when we look throughout the NFL landscape, and I'm not going to break down all these games, people. Really, I'm going to talk about Chargers winning in Cleveland. And I understand people in Cleveland maybe had some false hope after Jameis Winston came in and beat the Ravens. Maybe that was more of an indictment on the Ravens. And I get it that the game could have been sealed with that Kyle Hamilton interception. But I'm not going to break down Chargers-Browns. I'm not going to break down a lot of these games. I know Carolina won against New Orleans, but big whoop there. New Orleans, who came out like gangbusters. Remember, they beat Carolina week 1, 47-10, and then went to Dallas and won, I believe, 44 or 41-16. And a lot of people thought maybe the Saints could do some damage there in the NFC South. Well, they haven't won since, so you can forget about that. But kudos to Carolina and Bryce Young getting a win under his belt. Congratulations to them. Denver, Baltimore, and I talked about this on Thursday. To me, this was more of a test for Denver than it was for Baltimore. Now, granted that Baltimore came off of a terrible loss there in Cleveland, but for everything that they've done, the Broncos, a slow start to their year. Bo Nix trying to get his feet wet and find his way. Then all of a sudden gaining some traction and doing well to the point where they were 5-3 going into that game with a very good defense. And what happened? They got their doors blown off. Lamar Jackson, again, had a game which was very efficient, didn't make a lot of throws, certainly had a big-time passing performance where he threw for 280 yards and 3 touchdowns, but they win 41-10, and to me, Denver, I don't want to hear from them. Paper Tigers or Paper Broncos, whatever you want to call it. And granted, they'll probably have their moments, but to me, that was a big test. If Denver would have went in there and lost 27-24, I would have lived with it. 41-10, to me, you're frauds. So I'm not going to get into that. Am I going to get into Bengals and Raiders, where the Raiders were out to sea and they fired their offensive coordinator and a couple of other coaches on their staff? And who knows if Antonio Pierce, the head coach, if he's going to be long for this job, considering what's gone on there. And I get it. It may not be all of his fault because they do not have a quarterback there. It's not Gardner Minshew. It's not Aiden O'Connell. They're going to have to draft somebody in the first round, considering they're at 2-7. So am I going to dissect that game? Are the Bengals all of a sudden back and maybe they could do something here in the not only AFC North, but maybe on the fringe as far as being in the AFC playoff picture? I need to see more. Buffalo 7-2, beating the Dolphins, and Tua coming back. Came back the week before against Arizona and lost, but actually played pretty well in this game. And they got a 61-yard field goal there at the buzzer from Tyler Bass in order for the Bills to go 7-2, and the division is a wrap. I mean, think about this. The Bills are 7-2. The second place team is the 3-6 Jets, which they already have beaten their head-to-head, so they have a 4.5 game lead in the division. So you might as well just give them the AFC East. It's just a matter of where they're going to seed when it's all said and done. And remember, they still have a game against Kansas City, which is going to be huge for home field down the road. So that's something we'll have to keep in mind as that game comes up on the schedule in the weeks to come. But Buffalo, Miami, again, competitive. All right, we could say Miami did some good things. But still, they are 2-6, and they're going to be out to sea. Forget about it. No way that we could talk about Miami as far as being a team that's going to make any type of run up the conference and maybe catch a 6 or 7 seed. Now, that's other teams have to come back to the pack. Who knows? Stranger things have happened, but that's why that's not a game I'm going to get wrapped up in. The Cowboys and Stephen A. Smith control them all they want, and it's stupid at this point because Dallas looks like they're going to be a team that's going to be scuffling the rest of the way. They may not even have their quarterback who had to leave with a hamstring injury. And if that's going to be the case, although Cooper Rush is a pretty good fill-in, but the Cowboys may not be heard from that much more from now to the end of the season, which certainly is not going to sit well with Jerry Jones. Who knows what's going to happen there with the coach Mike McCarthy? And I get it. They've suffered a lot of injuries. Defensively with DeMarcus Lawrence as well as Micah Parsons, and we know that they don't have a running game, which obviously is to the fault of Jerry Jones. CeeDee Lamb also left with a shoulder injury. Who knows if he's going to be out for any length of time. So the Cowboys, even though they made it close, they're down in the ATL, but we talked about how the Falcons are 6-3 and they have a ton of road games here over the last 8. 3 more games at home and 5 on the road. And I understand that may not be a big difference, but for the Falcons, as they're going to try to see what they could do to not only win the division, which I think they'll be fine, because remember, the Falcons swept the Buccaneers this year, who are right behind them in the division. And remember, Tampa has to go to Kansas City tonight, so if KC wins, they will be 4-5 and will have a nice cushion there to win a division. But for Atlanta right now, it's about seeding and where they could stack. Could they be as high as a 2 seed? I don't think they'll be a 1, but can they be a 2 seed where they could possibly have a scenario where they could have 2 home games before having to possibly go to Detroit there in late January? That's where I'm sure their focus lies on. So let's see what the Falcons going to do there. But the Cowboys, they look like they're going to be a lost cause here before you know it. New England and Tennessee, really? Am I going to unpack that game? I understand Drake May made that unbelievable play to get the game into overtime. And Mason Rudolph, the former Steeler, actually had a pretty good game. But those 2 teams are going nowhere fast. And even though Tennessee won in overtime, but really, am I going to have a 5-minute sermon on that game? Absolutely not. And then we look at Jacksonville, Philadelphia. Jacksonville, again, another team that's been a major disappointment. And even with Doug Peterson coming back to his old stomping grounds, where he won a Super Bowl back in 2017, but they were no match for the Eagles. And you had that wondrous play, which when you look at all of the offensive plays just this year in the NFL, and I talked about the one-handed catches, and I talked about even some of the, over the course of the season, whether it be stiff arms or certain plays that were made. But what Saquon Barkley did yesterday was something that was out of the matrix. By him on a 3rd and 6 pass, right there in the flat from Jalen Hurts, and after securing it, he makes a couple of spin moves, breaks some tackles, and then as he avoids another tackle, not only leapfrogging over the defender, but doing it in reverse. If you haven't seen that highlight, go to YouTube. That is one that you're going to watch like 3 and 4 times over, because it's one of those things where you rub your eyes and say, what did I just watch? Saquon Barkley just showing his athletic freaks to the ultimate peak. Just an unbelievable play. But for the Eagles, winning again, keeping pace with the Commanders, but again, they're playing Jacksonville. Jacksonville is a team that you would think with their head coach may be gone. The quarterback who signed that $250 million deal, he's not going anywhere. And they have certainly regressed since their playoff run a couple of years ago. Just a terrible job by Jacksonville. And then we talked about the Rams and what they did in Seattle. Minnesota and Indy, that was a flex game. They moved Jacksonville, Philadelphia to the 4 o'clock slot. Well, I believe it was 1 o'clock, one of those 2 time frames. But then you had Indy and Minnesota. I didn't watch a lick of this game. But the Colts, even with Joe Flacco there and no Anthony Richardson, we talked about that on Thursday's podcast. But Minnesota keeps pace, although they do not have the tiebreaker right now against the Lions, but keep pace with them in the NFC North by winning 21-13. And Sam Darnold actually played pretty well in the game. So for the Vikings, a lot of people think that could be a team that maybe could even be a threat to the Lions. But considering what they did a couple weeks ago in Minnesota, winning the game, and not to say that that's the end-all be-all, but that's why I started off the NFL theme with the Lions as being the NFL's best, even though you do have a team in the AFC who is undefeated. But that's what you have there in the NFL. There isn't anything else to really discuss, anything else to uncover. Like I mentioned, Chargers-Browns, not going to go there. All these other games, what? Houston and the Jets. I know Houston's been ailing there. That was Thursday night's game. And I don't even want to hear that the Jets, with that win, and even with a little bit of an underbelly of their schedule, maybe they could get to 6-6, as I'll prop up their schedule now just to take a peek. Now, they go to Arizona, which is not going to be an easy game. So people could think that, oh, wait, it's Arizona. Well, as I just mentioned a little while ago, they're in first place, maybe by the slimmest of margins, but still, as of right now, when you wake up or as you go online to see these standings, they are in first place. But then after that, they have a game against the Colts, which is a Sunday night game, and I don't know. Colts 2 of the next 3 weeks on Sunday night. And then they have the Seahawks, who they host, and then they go to Miami followed by at Jacksonville. So they have a stretch here where the Jets can maybe, I don't want to say make up some ground because they're not going to make up ground on the Bills, but certainly could get themselves a little bit healthier as far as the standings go. So that's one just to pay attention to. I got to see what's going to happen with them before I can even think about them winning those games against teams that aren't going to be as stout as the early part of their schedule, whether it was playing Buffalo or even going to Pittsburgh or playing Minnesota and London. So I'm not going to go crazy there, but they did beat Houston, and I understand Houston, their wide receiving core, no Stephon Diggs, no Nico Collins, nicked up a little bit. And Houston on the road, I don't trust. And granted that they have a very good record and they're going to win the AFC South, but they can win their wild card game at home convincingly, just like they did last year against Cleveland. But let me see them have a good road game. And not a game in Indianapolis, not a game against a team like that. I want to see them play a stout team. And we're going to see that down the road because Houston, I believe, has to go to Kansas City later on. Let me just double check that game. Yeah, they go to Kansas City because that's that Saturday Christmas deal. Because remember, you're going to have the 2 games on Saturday, the 21st, which also coincides with the college football playoff, where Houston goes to Kansas City and Baltimore plays against Pittsburgh. And then, of course, on Christmas, that's when the Ravens will go to Houston and then Kansas City will go to Pittsburgh there on Christmas Day. So that's going to be a big test for them. And they do go to Dallas. I don't know what that's going to mean here at this point for the Houston Texans. Now, we know they have a big game Sunday night where they're going to host. They're not going to go on the road, but they're going to host the Lions. So that's going to be an interesting test for them and a very low-key good game there on the schedule. But one more time, if Houston's going to be taken seriously, especially when we get to postseason play, they're going to have to win on the road. And just knowing that they have to go to Dallas, which I believe is a Monday night game. All right, if Dak Prescott is healthy, who knows? They haven't played well at home this year, but and I understand I'm pulling straws at this point when it comes to a Cowboy team. But to me, that game against Kansas City in Kansas City is going to be an interesting test for them to see whether or not you're going to be taking them seriously come January. But that's it. That's your NFL, people. There isn't much else to discuss. And I'll get into more of the schedule and Week 10 as we get to Thursday's podcast, as we'll go there at that time. But now as I turn my attention, let me see any key injuries, anything of the like. Oh, how can I forget this? The trade deadline is tomorrow. I don't know what players are going to be moved between now and the 4 o'clock deadline. Of course, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, it comes on Election Day, where, of course, the NFL does whatever it takes to try to suck the air out of any room, whether it's Christmas Day for the NBA, whether it's any other day for that matter in the regular season, and even college football. Think about that. The college football playoff, which starts on the 20th, and I believe you have 3 games on the 21st, that Saturday. Oh, no, we got to throw some NFL games there to throw a wrench into the college football viewing, but the diehard college football fan will watch and they'll tune in back and forth. But anyway, trade deadline tomorrow. No rumors or anything of the like. I did read a report that a lot of players, they want to get traded to Washington all of a sudden. Could you imagine? 3-4 years ago, this wouldn't even have been a thought in any player's mind, considering who the owner was at the time, Daniel Snyder, as we know. But for players that want to go to Washington to play with Jaden Daniels, hey, that's a great thing. And it's good for the league because Washington, as we all know, it's a very proud franchise. We understand from the days of the Redskins, but let's see if there's going to be any wheeling and dealing. And we've seen a lot over the last few years with the trade deadline. Unlike even as early as a dozen years ago, there were no such thing as trades happening in the end. And talk about 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't even know when the trade deadline was. And back then, it used to be in the middle of October, or even early October for that matter. Now, it's pretty much right at smack in the middle of the season. So let's see what teams are going to move and shake here to try to bring in some reinforcements to their rosters and see what they could do here for the home stretch of the season and maybe into the playoffs. But trade deadline tomorrow, 4 p.m. You know I'll be on top of it. Definitely tune into my YouTube channel, even Instagram and TikTok, the J Reels podcast on those latter platforms, and YouTube at J Reels for any hot takes, for any assessments of any big trades that happen between now and tomorrow, 4 p.m. All right, now let me turn my attention to college football because we talked about this on Thursday. Penn State. I don't want to hear from them. And I know the coach came out with a big-time mea culpa saying that it's all on me, it's all on us, and rightfully so. And granted that their quarterback came back from that knee injury, and you didn't expect them to all of a sudden throw the ball over the lot, because Ohio State knew that if they were to beat Penn State here, that's only going to pump them up as far as getting themselves maybe into the top 4 for college football, but certainly put them in good stead in the eyes of the selection committee in order for them to make it into the playoff. Now, if they would have lost, they would have been in a scenario where they would have had 2 losses and they would have had to run the table from here on out, which may not have been a bad thing, because it's not as if they're going to face a Michigan team that has beaten them over the last 3 years. They should be able to beat them handily this year, considering that Michigan is 5-3, I believe, overall, or maybe even 5-4 for that matter. But for Penn State, and let me put it on them right now, they are not a team to be taken seriously. I know that they're going to probably make it to the playoff. They just suffered their first loss, and we would think that once they qualify as a 5-12, that maybe they'll win a game. But as far as them going deep or really doing something in that postseason tournament, I don't believe it. Now, unless Drew Aller, if he comes back and plays well down the stretch and maybe carries his team as deep as they possibly can go, then maybe that could be the case. But considering what happened there on Saturday, they had opportunities after opportunities where they just either fumbled at the goal line or had another scenario where at 20-13, here they were looking to see if they could go ahead and tie the game, and they get stopped on a goal line stand. They had 3 runs and an incomplete pass, and that was pretty much a ball game there midway through the fourth quarter, where you knew that the Nittany Lions had to punch it in. And even Ohio State, they made mistakes too. Ohio State had a pick 6 there on the goal line where they were looking to march in, and Penn State had a 10-0 lead in the game on top of that. But Ohio State, in their pedigree, they were able to muster up enough drives, and even after the 10-0 lead by Penn State, they answered with 2 touchdown drives and back-to-back drives right after Penn State took that early lead. So if you're Penn State, no excuses. You don't want to hear anything. And kudos to the head coach by coming out and being accountable, because I thought going into the weekend that if Penn State, even if they would have won 20-19, they win the game, they get the piano off their back. They've lost 8 straight now to the Buckeyes there and Ohio State. And all you could say is that Penn State, yeah, they're going to qualify when it's all said and done. But are you going to take them seriously once you get to the latter part of December and maybe into January? Absolutely not. So that's the story there with Penn State. Now, for the other teams that are, I'm not going to say on the bubble, but certainly in the playoff mix, Texas A&M, what happened to them? Now, we understand Texas A&M, they're a team that a lot of people thought, considering in the SEC, that as stout as it is with a lot of the big teams that are there, and we know who those teams are, but for Texas A&M, all right, you're tied at 20 at the half, you're on the road at South Carolina, but it's almost as if the team stood in the locker room and had a bunch of imposters come out in the second half as they got railroaded 24-0 in the second half. They lose 44-20, and to me, Texas A&M, I get it. When it's all said and done, they may end up sneaking in. They may be a team that could possibly get into the tournament, but when they have that type of performance, and South Carolina has been a live dog. They've been a team that has actually played pretty well against other teams in the conference throughout the year. Now, they haven't been successful. They haven't won those games, but they certainly have put up a fight. And here in their building, I understand, but for them to just lay an egg in the second half the way they did, to me, that was inexcusable. And I get it. You could lose to a team, you could get beat, and after the big win against LSU the week before, for them to just not show up in the second half is inexcusable. And now they have 2 losses. Remember, they lost to Notre Dame all the way back in the opening week of the season. Now they're going to be sweating bullets to see whether or not they're going to get in. And the rest of their schedule is New Mexico State, at Auburn, and then Texas at home. So chances are they're going to get a 3rd loss at some point. And who knows, with Auburn, I get it. It's at Auburn. And with the following week, Auburn having to go to Alabama, maybe all of the energy will be put up to see if they could beat Texas A&M there. But even if Texas A&M does win, and although the game is at home, they have Texas coming into their building, and they could be put out the pasture then. So they certainly made their bed. Now they have to lie in it. So for A&M, just a terrible job there. What more can you say? as far as them just trying to, if they would have won the game, even if they would have lost one of those two games, whether at Auburn or Texas, they still would have made it to the postseason. But now it's dubious at best, considering they have those two games there to wrap up their season. And then the other game that was a surprise was, well, let me talk about Georgia. I know Carson Beck, who a lot of people don't trust, even yours truly. 3 interceptions. You thought Florida, could they actually have a chance to upset Georgia and Athens on top of all that? But they were able to stave off the Gators and win 34-20. But the other big loss was another Texas team, this time victorious. The Red Raiders, Texas Tech, winning against Iowa State, scoring a last-second touchdown, and Iowa State was undefeated. And Iowa State was one of those teams that were right around 12, hovering in that top 12 to 13 range. And boy, did they get a big surprise there by Texas Tech. Great job by them upsetting the Cyclones. And now you have to wonder whether or not Iowa State, even though they do have the one loss, but considering with all these teams that are jumbled in the mix there, they dropped down to 17 in the rankings. And interestingly enough, I thought the selection committee were going to have the unveiling last Tuesday, based on what I read, but I believe it's going to be tomorrow. So come Thursday, we'll talk about it. And I know I didn't talk about it on Thursday's podcast for that reason only. Based on what I saw, I thought we were going to get the first unveiling of the teams that were going to be jockeying for position and in position to qualify for the first ever 12-team playoff. But I believe that's going to be tomorrow, or maybe Thursday for that matter. Let me just take a look at that. But that will be revealed, and that will be discussed. And now that I see there's some breaking news here in the NFL, I'll talk about that in a second. But for college football, it's going to be fast and furious here from now to the end to see where these teams are going to end up. And that selection show is going to be fascinating to see where these teams are going to lie and which teams are going to be grumbling and actually startled to know where they're going to land here in these top 12. But right now you have Oregon, Georgia, Ohio State moves up with Penn State going back, Miami 4, and they were trailing early against Duke before they blew them out. Texas, they round out your top 5. So again, Oregon, Georgia, Ohio State, Miami, Texas. Penn State drops down to 6th. Tennessee, Indiana, with their big win, they are now in the 8th spot. BYU, Notre Dame, followed by Alabama, who moves up. And Alabama, LSU this week, which is going to be enormous. Followed by Boise, SMU, a big win, beating Pitt. And then LSU, followed by Texas A&M, Ole Miss. So I'll keep my eyes on that, and obviously you keep an eye on my social media accounts, whether it be on my YouTube channel at JReels, another plug there, as well as Instagram, TikTok, for more when it comes to where the selection looks at these teams as we're now into the month of November and getting deeper toward the end of this college football season. All right, now let me pivot, take off the helmet and shoulder pads, and I'm going to discuss some NBA news before I even get to the baseball, because now let's wean off of the baseball. I know I talked a lot over the last month, and rightfully so, but you got some hot stove stuff and some other news that's been percolating there when it comes to what's happening on the diamond. But NBA, I know the big story out of the last week or last few days has been what's going on in Philadelphia with Joel Embiid, and he nursing those injuries, played in the Olympics as we know, and now is a guy who has not played. In fact, Paul George, will get his first action, I believe, tonight. And let me pull up the schedule here to see who they're going to play. And yes, don't worry, I'll get to the news there with the NFL as you had some late-breaking news. But with the Suns and the Sixers, he's going to make his debut, saying barring any setbacks. And Paul George, we understand his injury history, but going back to Embiid, he hasn't played. There's a columnist in the Philadelphia Inquirer by the name of Marcus Hayes who came out and lashed at the former MVP, saying that he has dedicated his season and pretty much the rest of his career to his young son Arthur, who was also the name of his late brother as well, who was killed in a car accident a few years ago, and how he was pretty much dedicating his career to those two individuals, the dearly departed, and of course his young son. And for Marcus Hayes, I don't know what actually had to grind against Embiid, but coming out to say that although, yes, he could dedicate his life work on the court to them, but we got to see you on the court healthy in order for you to dedicate yourself to them. So what happened there? When Hayes came into the locker room and Embiid confronted him and there was a shove, a little bit of a scuffle, and now you have a scenario where I don't know if Hayes is barred from the locker room, and there have been some comments by Joel Embiid saying that he's given everything to the city, played with the broken face, having to wear a mask a couple of times, broken fingers, a knee. He's given everything he's had to the city of Philadelphia. And let me see if I can pull up the quote real quick. He had come out to say, yes, that he's done way too much for the city, putting myself at risk for people to say that. All right, he says way too much for the city. All right, Joel, I think it's a little bit strong, only because it's not as if you're a sanitation worker or fireman and granted, that's not a knock on you, but you're a basketball player. Can we start there? And I understand that you're doing whatever it takes to get back on the court. You're doing whatever it takes to stay healthy. And yes, he could have lost all that weight in the offseason, and I'm sure he probably lifted weights along the way too. But with that being said, you can't stay healthy, my G. This isn't a thing where people are just trying to come at you for the sake of it. And I'm not trying to be in the Marcus Hayes foxhole by any stretch. But he does have a point. He's not wrong. He isn't. And in order for you to be great, you can't play 39 games a year. And people are going to say, oh, well, come on, man, give him a break. He's 7'2". He's got bad feet dating back to his days in college at Kansas. He's also had bad knees. He's had all these injuries. Come on, you got to come some slack. No, at some point, you got to say, hey, when are you going to get healthy? For all the people that killed Kawhi Leonard, the king of load management with the knee injury that he's had, that he suffered 3 years ago, and everybody gets on his case, and even though Kawhi, he has that force field around him where he doesn't talk to anybody. Where Embiid, I know he wants to be liked, and he's a likable guy, although he's a bit of a goofball at times on the court. But, sorry, what's good for Kawhi Leonard and whatever criticism that he gets, Joel Embiid's going to get the same, especially if he's going to come out and say, oh, I dedicate my career on the court to my son and my late brother. Well, if you're not on the court, how are you going to do that? So that's my point. And again, Embiid, I get it. You could come out and say, oh, what I've done for the city. And yes, he's come back, and we've seen him with the black mask on, and we've seen him play through injuries, and we see him lumbering on one leg, where him on one leg at whatever, 50, 70, maybe even 30% is better than 100% of a lot of guys in the league. And kudos to you, Joel. No doubt. But whether your conditioning is at top peak or whether you hit the weight room all the time, you can't stay on the court. So something else has to give. Whether that means you have to do some yoga, stretching, and maybe he has done that. But my point is that Embiid is a walking rap sheet when it comes to a medical history that could fill the page, and maybe it could fill a book at this point. So, and it's not a knock, but in order for you to be great, you got to be healthy and play on the court. That's it. Why is Jordan great? Why is he one of the greatest of all time? Yes, we could talk about all the championships and the scoring prowess. It's because he played every game. I say this all the time. When you look at, and I understand he's a different breed and he's from some planet elsewhere. But all you got to do is just know during that 3-year run, the second three-peat from 96 to 98, the Bulls played a total of 304 basketball games. How many games did Michael Jordan miss? 0. That's it. That's how you're great. When you're on the court and you're playing all the time and you're showing how great you are. Not great for 30 games, not great for a playoff series, not great for a stretch of the season. No. And I understand, it's a different NBA. Players are going to play the full 82. I get it. But if you play 75, maybe even 70, I'll give you that. But you fall way short of that, so sorry. So that's the deal with Embiid. And then you have another big injury where Paolo Banchero, the Orlando Magic forward, who is out indefinitely with a torn right oblique. Now, here's the deal. He's going to be evaluated or reevaluated in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And that's just to see if it's 100% healthy. So that is a huge loss for a Magic team that's trying to see if they could match up with the big dogs in the Eastern Conference. We all know the Celtics and Knicks, etc. But for the Magic, that is a huge blow for them. Let's see how they manage that throughout the course of this next 2-month stretch, as they're not going to have Banchero in the lineup. And then you also have a scenario, no other injuries, right? Let me just make that. Oh, the other thing was Victor Wembanyama. Now, I get it that the NBA is stat-oriented. And this is the first for me that Wembanyama had a 5x5 game the other day. And by him having a 5x5 means that he had at least 5 in all categories. Points, assists, rebounds, steals, and block shots. I never knew that was such a stat. Now, if you told me he had a quintuple double, similar to a triple-double or even a quadruple-double, is that right? Quintuple? Yes, I believe it's quintuple. If he had double digits in points, rebounds, assists, blocks, and steals, that would be something. And if you recall, back in the day, look this guy up, Alvin Robertson, he was a guy that actually had a few quadruple doubles. So, not that Wemby had that, but he had a game where I believe he scored 25 points, 9 rebounds, 7 assists, 5 blocks, and 5 steals. And that's a stat all of a sudden? I mean, that's news to me, and I get it maybe because it's Wemby and he had a freakish type game, so right away now it's a 5x5 game. All right, I mean, what's next? What other stat are we going to bring up that's going to be like so obscure that is going to be part of the sports, or at least in the basketball lexicon from now for years to come? A bit of a stretch if you ask me, but kudos to Wemby on this game. All right, fine, no doubt. But other than that, NBA, I mean, what else can I really get into? Yes, we can talk about teams that are hot and cold, etc. I know the Cavaliers haven't lost. Good for them. Excuse me, as they're 7-0. Off to a tremendous start. OKC, another team that's undefeated at 6-0. So let's see how long that they can go on these winning streaks. Suns have played well, 5-1. I picked them as a team that's going to be a disappointment. I know it's 6 games in, but certainly not looking good right at this very moment. Steph Curry, a lot of people thought he was going to be out a couple of days. He may be returning back to the lineup. They're 5-1 as they've gotten off to a great start in their own right. There seems to be some turbulence in Denver. Now, I got to read the article that came out a couple of days ago. I forgot who wrote it. I don't know if it was Ramona Shelburne, ESPN. But now it looks like you have a scenario where Nikola Jokic is unhappy. And I'm only paraphrasing that. And I understand people will say, well, Jay Rios, why don't you read the article? Yes, I know. I understand that. But I'm not going to massage it or go deep into it. But just reading that, and the little headline saying that, yeah, Jokic is a guy that certainly, for whatever the reason, whether it's with the front office or maybe even with certain teammates, that he has fallen out of favor there. But I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more on Thursday's podcast, considering I'm looking at the Nuggets right now. They're 3-3 at this very moment, and right now underachieving. And I believe Jamal Murray, he's out of the lineup. So that's what you have more so in the NBA. Nothing really else to get into. I don't know. Let me see. I know the Sixers are 1-4 with George coming back. And I picked them as an under this year because I figure with Embiid's health and even with Paul George for that matter, and we know that city starting for a title, they bring in a guy like George who can never be healthy and never even be relied on in big spots. To me, that is just a bad elixir for a Sixer franchise that will certainly call out on Paul George if he does not own up to that $212 million contract that he signed there in the offseason. So other than that, and the Jazz haven't won a game, they're 0-6. And I believe I picked the Jazz as an under last year, and that was the only, no, that was 2 years ago. The one under I got wrong was New Orleans. I picked them as an under and they were an over. And I was 5-1 last year, and who knows, that'll probably be the last time I'll actually have a decent record when it comes to my over-unders. So that's what we have there with the NBA. And let me get to the breaking news here. No shock, the Saints is the NFL. They fired Dennis Allen, who is a defensive coordinator and a pretty good one for that matter. But he's a guy that, dating back to his days when he was with the Raiders, in over his head as a head coach, and even with the hot start that I talked about, 2-0, blowing out the Panthers, blowing out the Cowboys in Dallas. And since then, they have not registered a victory. So now he gets his walking papers. And is it a surprise? I can't say it is, considering that they lost to the Panthers. And the Panthers, who, even though they got the one win earlier this year against the Raiders when Andy Dalton filled in for Bryce Young, but with Dalton out of the lineup and Bryce Young in, and Young winning the game yesterday, they said enough. Front office said bye-bye, Dennis Allen. And that is the deal there with the Saints and their head coach. I don't even know. They don't even have an interim set up yet. They do not have one as of right this very second. So we'll see who the interim coach is going to be as the Saints are marching out and definitely not marching in. Now, let me get to the NHL as I lace up the skates. And the Florida Panthers, I want to talk about them because there was another international series, this time in Finland. And I don't know how many more of these that the NHL have, because we saw that with the Devils and Sabres in Czech Republic or Czechia to start off the season. And then now you have another one just a month later. I don't know if this is a monthly thing as we get into, let's say, the new year. But for the Panthers who played the Dallas Stars, and we know the Stars are a threat to the Western Conference. I have them coming out of the West as far as a Stanley Cup representative is concerned. But for the Panthers, no hangover, 9-3-1, tops in the Atlantic, not tops overall, because that is the Winnipeg Jets, as they have 22 points, 11-1. Remember, they started off 8-0. They did suffer a loss against the Maple Leafs, but since then have won 3 in a row. So they're currently 11-1, 22 points the most in the National Hockey League. But for the Panthers, most in the Eastern Conference as well as the Atlantic, as we know. And they have been, right now, a team that looks like they're looking to see if they can repeat. And think about this. Remember, they made it to the Stanley Cup Finals 2 years in a row. They lost to the Vegas Golden Knights, as we know, 2 years ago. And then obviously winning last year against Edmonton. Although a 3-0 lead was erased where they had to play a Game 7 in their building. But as we all know, they raised the cup when it was all said and done. But kudos to the Panthers because they started off slow out of the gate. I believe they were 1-2. All right, big whoop. But since then, they have been a team, not going to say on a mission, but certainly not looking at last year as just banking on the success of winning a Stanley Cup and drunk off the power of that to think that they could just lace them up and beat any team. No, they played well. They've actually won 5 in a row and are at the very top of the Eastern Conference and the Atlantic Division at 19 points. So kudos to them. And the Stars will be fine, although they lost 2 in a row. And they got off to a good start in their own right, 7-4. And they're actually behind the Minnesota Wild, who've actually played pretty well. 8-1-2 is their record behind Winnipeg in that Central Division. So Florida, let's see if they can continue their good play. As far as my Islanders, do I even need to discuss this? And who knows if Patrick Roy, who, remember, last year, Lane Lambert, the coach at the time, was fired. They bring in Roy as the head coach, did a pretty good job. But now the Islanders, who made no offseason moves, who really did not do anything to see if they could at least compete in the Eastern Conference to be somewhere middle of the pack as opposed to the bottom rung and make it as a 7th or 8th seed, will they lose their top scorer in a one, Matthew Barzal, or as you say, their top playmaker. Matthew Barzal with an upper body injury is going to be on IR and miss at least 10 games, so he's going to be out. Adam Pelech took a puck to the mouth there the other night in Buffalo. He's going to be out for some significant amount of time, as well as Mike Riley, who also got knocked out on a stretcher. And the Islanders, who lost to the Rangers there yesterday at the Garden, 4-6-2, very slow start. And I get it. The Islanders will have their moments and their stretches where they're going to tease you. They're going to be a team that will be on that fringe, will be hovering in that 7th or 8th seed. And then in the last week of the season, they'll get that. And what will happen? They'll lose in the first round of the playoffs because they've done nothing to their roster in order to fortify it to compete with the Panthers, with the Rangers, with the Carolina Hurricanes, with the Boston Bruins, with teams like that. So they're going to be hovering at the bottom of that race for the 7th or 8th or 1st or 2nd wild card, and then you're going to get in, and maybe they'll have a good game or two, or they'll lose an overtime game, go down 0-2 in the series, maybe win 1 or 2 games at home before losing a game 5, and that's it. Off to the spring and summertime they go. I only bring that up because I'm an Islander fan, and it's frustrating to know that the team does nothing to improve their own selves when it comes to goal scoring, and they cannot score goals. They've been shut out a million times here to start off the season. And think about it, they played 12 games, and they scored 28 goals. So do the math. And I'm not trying to say they got to be a juggernaut. I'm not trying to say that they have to be amongst the tops of the goal scorers in the, as far as teams go in the NHL. But they are a team, if I do this real quick, they may end up last. Right now, I see one team, Nashville's 29. And remember, they got off to a very slow start in their own right, although they played a little bit better. Islanders are 28. Yes, think about it. The Islanders, Red Wings have 29. The Islanders, although they played 12 games and they played a lot, there's other teams, a lot of teams have 12, a lot of teams have played 13 games. They are the lowest goal-scoring team in the NHL. You know what? I take that back. That's Anaheim. Now as I look through the Western Conference. Anaheim has scored 24 goals, but they pretty much have a similar record than the Islanders. 4-5-2, the Islanders are 4-6-2. So that's all you need to know about this Islander team, that now you lose their big playmaker. This team isn't all about Brock Nelson and Bo Horvat, and I mean, that's all they have. Those are the guys that are going to be the focal points for them to score goals, and right now, not looking pretty good if you're an Islander fan. But other than that, NHL, Wild, like I said, has played well. Capitals have played well, and Ovechkin has scored some goals here. I think Ovechkin has 7 goals so far in this season. So right now he's at 859. He is 35 away from Wayne Gretzky tying him. So you know the watch will continue as he gets closer and closer and closer. And I hope he does it this year. I really do. I hope he gets to break Wayne Gretzky's record this year. You don't have to wait a whole offseason, a whole year to have Ovechkin do this. So kudos to the Great 8 as he pursues the Great 1. But that's what I have there with the NHL. And then to wrap up with baseball, and yes, here we are, just days after the World Series, and a ton of pitchers and players have opted out of their contracts. And to no surprise, well, their name is Gerrit Cole, who I believe had until last night for the Yankees to offer him the extra year where he could have the contract 5 years at $180 million. So because of that opt-out, the Yankees have first dibs in order for him to tack on an extra year. Now, I don't know what's happening as of right this second. There hasn't been any news whether or not the Yankees have attached that final year to the contract, where it did say he had until Sunday night and he opted out, I believe, late Thursday. So we'll see how that unfolds. But whether it's he, Blake Snell opted out, no shock there, Corbin Barnes and a bunch of others. So Sean Manaea, a lot of pitchers. We'll see what's going to happen here, as even the Braves, and I got to give it up to Atlanta, because that team, who for whatever the reason, they're the only ones thinking that it's the hot stove and the general managers meetings where they've already made a trade. Jorge Soler got shipped to Anaheim, which will at least add to their offense, at least some power to go along with Mike Trout and even Anthony Rendon if he ever puts on a uniform again. But for Soler getting traded for Griffin Canning, a pitcher who, all right, Canning, but who knows? He'll go to Atlanta and all of a sudden he'll turn into Tom Glavine. But they made some moves. They also re-signed a couple of pitchers, starting pitcher Reynaldo Lopez, who gave them a good contribution this year, as well as Aaron Bummer, a relief pitcher. So the Braves, they're making moves as if it's already in the middle of the season, where other teams are trying to see what they can do to re-sign players, whether it is Juan Soto, and we could talk about that, but I'll save that for when we get deep into the owners and the hot stove meetings in the early part of December. But I bring this up only because with all these pitchers opting out, now we're put on the radar to see what's going to happen here over the course of these next few weeks. And do we expect a lot of activity? I don't know just yet. I'm sure once we get to the winter meetings, a lot could happen then. But remember, last year, right after the winter meetings, I believe it was right after, maybe it was before, when Shohei Ohtani, I believe it was that first Saturday in December when Ohtani signed that $700 million deal. Who knows if Soto's going to go that soon, and he's going to have a lot of suitors. I would think very few suitors. I say a lot because he said he was open to 30 teams. Remember, he made those comments right after they lost the World Series to the Dodgers there Wednesday night, and maybe that wasn't the brightest thing to say, but of course he's putting himself on that big stage as the big free agent here in this upcoming offseason. But you know I'll be on top of it, people, and we'll certainly break it all down when the time comes, or of course on my socials. Please stay tuned to that, subscribe, all that. I would sincerely appreciate it. And then quickly with the ratings of the World Series, the highest ratings since 2017, but 2017 did outlast what the Yankees and Dodgers did. Now, they needed some length. They needed at least a sixth game, maybe even a seventh game, and I'm sure that probably would have superseded what Houston and LA did back in 2017. But they did get good ratings. They averaged over 15, just a tick below 16 million. And for Game 5, it actually peaked at 21 million. I believe the rating was about 16 million overall. But it peaked at 21, especially with that Dodger comeback and how it all took place there. So that was good for baseball. And even though they would have liked more length, but I'm sure they were satisfied with the viewership by people who watched throughout the course of that 5-game series. And then lastly, Bob Costas retires from Major League Baseball play-by-play. I know he was atrocious. I didn't really talk about Costas because to me that was small potatoes. A lot of the stuff that he said in the wild card and the division series, bringing up baseball of the 50s and 60s, trying to give history lessons, which to me I like. I'm all about that, but I believe he went a little bit over the top and overboard with that, which to the viewer, they're like, wait a minute, am I here to watch a history lesson or I'm here to watch a baseball game that's taking place right in front of my eyes? All right, Bob Costas, yes, you got called out to the carpet and maybe it was time for him to do so. I'm sure he's going to be around in some way, shape, or form when it comes to baseball or the Olympics or whatever, so it's not as if he's going to completely fall off the map, but certainly him stepping down was a good thing considering the criticism that he received here throughout the course of the early part of the Major League Baseball playoffs. And that'll do it, my good people. That is it. Another episode just about in the books as always. Thank you so much for stopping by, carving out precious time out of your day to listen to what it is I have to say about what goes on in the world of sports. And one more time, people, if you haven't done so, please, I implore you to subscribe on my YouTube channel at JReels, as well as Apple, Spotify, whatever podcast platform that you listen to. Please throw me a few stars, leave a rating, leave a comment, all that good stuff. That's just going to increase the visibility of this podcast with all the others that are out there. And for those who don't know who the JReels podcast is, please, if you could do your due diligence by just hitting the subscribe button, going there, leaving a comment, doing whatever it takes, take a screenshot, share it with me, share it with your family, friends, foes, frenemies, who are the casual, good, great, diehard, rabid, kooky sports fan in your life. Again, that's going to go a long way to getting the word out about yours truly. And speaking of which, real quick, tomorrow on my YouTube channel at JReels, I'm going to have a very special vlog. It's an election day vlog, and I'm going to leave it at that. It's going to surprise you. It's going to shock you. But at the end of the day, you're going to be like, that sounds like JReels. So you won't want to miss that election day vlog. And it may not be what you think, but election day vlog coming tomorrow. You definitely don't want to miss it with election day. I know. Here we are, 24 hours away from a big day for our democracy, etc. And I won't get into that at this very moment. But please, one more time, subscribe, rate, review, all that good stuff, as I implore you to do that. And if you want to hit me up with a question, comment, suggestion on any of my socials, you can do us with the following. As I mentioned earlier, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, the JReels Podcast, Twitter, X, JReels1, just a number, the old-fashioned way, the JReels Podcast at gmail.com. I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals, because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to do, people. This is why I quit my job over 8 months, going on 9 months ago, to pursue this full time. My love, my passion. I've been talking about sports since birth. I've been doing this podcast well over 6.5 years without earning a penny. Now it's time for me to earn my keep. That's why I'm telling you guys and gals to please subscribe, rate, review on all my platforms, channels, etc. Because I'm going nowhere as long as I'm alive, breathing, to continue to deliver nothing but passion, fire, fury, energy with my thoughts, opinions, critiques, praise, analysis, feelings on anything and everything that happens on the world of the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the JReels Podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx to South Beach to South Central to South Pacific and all points beyond, peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the JReels Podcast, on the flip, baby.